with active travel, with cycling, walking, we don't have a 5-year plan. We don't have consistent funding. We don't have national leadership. And we don't have a kind of plan for infrastructure.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Wommer, an author and journalist who's covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. We're going to take a look at the Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget today, and in particular those aspects of the budget statement and the supporting documentation that related to transport, of course. Later on, you have an interview with Laura Laker, who is a leading writer on all matters concerned with cycling, and was the author of Potholes and Pavements, a recent book on the bumpy ride of Britain's national cycle network. You'll be talking to Laura about the UK government's consultation on walking, wheeling and cycling for England.
Well, jolly good, Mark. I must say, walking, wheeling and cycling doesn't do it for me. But anyway, we used to call it active travel. But anyway, more important, Mark, what have you discovered in kind of reading those documents, the huge amount of documents that comes out with the budget and hidden bits and kind of stuff they don't really want us to know about? What's the most interesting things you've discovered?
Well, in some ways, Christian, it was some of the things that happened before the budget were as interesting as those things that were in the statement or the documentation published on the day. And of course, there's been lots of general political and media analysis of the fact that this was a widely leaked and trailed budget in the run-up to the 26th of November. And
Briefed on budget, I think we could call it, yes.
Lots of controversy around this. A couple of notable features from the transport perspective were that in the weekend before the budget, the UK government announced a cap on regulated train fares in England from March of next year. So a freeze on those fares. As the government stated, this was the first time in 30 years that such a freeze had been applied. And I think that was generally welcomed by all sorts of rail users and rail supporters. I don't know how you react.
Well, just explain to me, Mark, because regulated fares is a bit of an outdated concept in an industry that will be entirely owned or nearly entirely owned by and run by the government. So they can regulate any old fares.
It's a legacy of the privatisation legislation, which created this category of regulated,
which are basically season tickets and off-peak fares.
And sort of singles and returns.
Yeah.
It doesn't really necessarily apply to the widely used advance purchase discounted tickets that, of course, are used by many thousands of passengers on a
But they come at different
basis.
prices, so we don't really know if they would go up or not.
That's right. And some cynics have suggested, well, they could sort of apply the freeze, the cap to the regulated fares and then recover the money through manipulation of the advance purchase mechanisms. But I think what they're trying to signal is with the fares freeze is, first of all, the contribution that rail travel or increases in the cost of rail travel would otherwise make to the cost of living, which is one of the themes of the government's and the Chancellor's budget, was addressing the long-running cost of living crisis. And also, I think they're trying to draw a link here between the UK government's policy of returning the railways to public ownership, which is partly said to be about ending the profit extraction of the private operators. Therefore, if the profit extraction is ending, you, the passengers, can get some benefits directly from this in terms of frozen fares.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I put out on my social media that this was the first canny move by the government almost since it'd been brought in, because it was designed to show rail renationalisation in a good light. But there are complexities. I bumped into Andy Lord, who's the Transport Commissioner in London, and he said, well, it's quite difficult to work out what's going to happen on the London Overground, on the Elizabeth line. Those fares might still go up a bit because Transport for London has been squeezed for ages over the years, and has to kind of basically pay its own way. And so we don't know whether there's going to be increases on those fares.
Right, and so another big announcement that was made in advance of the budget, the day before, in fact, was that the UK government came out in favour of Heathrow Airport Limited's proposal for the third runway at the airport and the expansion of the airport. Loyal listeners will recall that at the beginning of the year, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to some general surprise, signalled her support for a third runway and invited proposals from anybody and everybody. There turned out to be two proposals, one from Heathrow Airport Limited, the current owners and operators of the airport, and one other private sector proposal. So the day before the budget, they signalled that they would back the Heathrow Airport Limited proposal, which is for a longer version of the third runway, which also entails substantial works to move the alignment of the M25 motorway and the knocking down of a significant number of houses in the area, and that they were now proceeding with the fairly complex planning process, which required
fairly complex. I think I think Fairley's done a lot of work there.
a bit of an understatement.
Yes, extremely complex.
Given the amount of parliamentary scrutiny that's required, first of all, before the developer can even come forward with the development consent order. But this is part of the Chancellor adopted this idea because she sees it as part of the growth agenda.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Yes. However, many reservations there will be amongst the public, residents,
And I suspect
as many of our listeners.
a lot of people suspect like me that it's never going to happen. And so, Mark, right, that was in advance of the budget. So
That was in advance.
So let's. I mean, this was so leaked and briefed and whatever. It was just completely ridiculous and chaotic, and it remains chaotic to this day. But what was actually in it?
So when the Chancellor finally got up to make the statement, which of course had been leaked an hour earlier in full through a mistake by the Office for Budget Responsibility,
Whose head has fallen.
subsequently, yes, indeed. So when another controversial infrastructure scheme, which has the personal backing of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, featured early on in her speech and several times in the associated documentation, and this is the Lower Thames Crossing, which loyal listeners will know is a proposal to build a big new motorway in a tunnel between Essex and Kent, supposedly to relieve congestion on the M25 motorway and allow easier access, largely for lorries, to and from the continent. So not only did she reiterate her support for that, but she announced a further £891 million.
It's a very precise figure, isn't it?
It is very precise, surprisingly, and £891 million further of public money going in to sort of pump prime what the government contends will be a privately financed solution to ultimately build and operate not just the new crossing, but the existing Dartford crossing as well. So the owner-operator will have the tolls from both crossings to draw on in order to recover their investment. At least that's the cunning plan. But we're told to expect a lot more on this in 2026 because there'll be a market engagement with the private sector next year.
Well, there is a problem in that there hasn't been a PFI scheme for more than a decade because the Tories stopped doing them, and the expertise of how to do this is difficult. But also, of course, it's a more expensive way of doing it, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, it's been reported elsewhere in the media that the private sector finance expertise, which is being brought in to develop this model, is it those advisors that are themselves going to be paid a staggering £24 million for their in inverted commas advice. So, nice word.
Can't you put in for that, Mark?
I don't unfortunately have the credentials for that, but the nice work if you can get it. But then moving on to the budget more generally, motoring featured very significantly in the budget in various ways, many of them connected to electric vehicles. So let's just have a look at some of the points here, Christian.
I mean, just to say, the Campaign for Better Transport found 5 good things that they liked about this budget. So you're going to set out some of these.
Some of them will overlap with what CBT said and perhaps with other campaigning organisations as well. But there was generally a feeling that something needed to be done about the fact that fuel duty income is falling as a result of the large-scale switch to electric vehicles, which clearly don't need to buy, the owners don't need to buy a petrol or diesel and therefore don't pay duty. So the government, the Chancellor, announced the introduction from April 2028 of an electric vehicle mileage levy. And that will be levied on a per mile basis. But
3p per mile is
that seems to be the number that's being kicked around. But all of this will follow a consultation because they don't really know how to do this. And all that's been said so far is, don't worry, there won't be a tracker in your vehicle. So the state will not be looking at your movements and seeing where you've been.
So they won't do it through an app?
No, that's right.
Which seems the obvious thing to do it through an app.
Given that we all allow ourselves to track all the time anyway with our mobile devices, you might think that was a logical conclusion. But apparently it's going to be collected on the basis of a declaration by the...
Right. Well, I mean, I've looked into this a bit, and they clearly the MOT is the key point. You have an MOT, but you only have an MOT if cars are 3 years old or more. So the first 2 years they wouldn't be able to do that. But so obviously after that, they could do it for the mileage on the mileometer, assuming that people don't make that fraudulent. It's more difficult nowadays. It's largely the mileometer is electronic, but I'm sure people find ways around that. But they have to deal with the first 2 years, and I understand that what they're going to do is impose some sort of standard charge, and then you will have to send in your reading and say, no, I've been overcharged.
Yeah.
But of course, if you've been undercharged, there won't be much incentive to send in your reading. But presumably they'll make people do that. But so look, I worked this out. Look, if you did 10,000 miles, which is kind of 200 miles a week, is kind of do many people do much more than that? That would only come out at 300 quid. So the whinging about it from the various electric car owners, it seems a bit out of place, really. I understand you were listening to Radio 5 and they're full of moaners.
Well, essentially people are saying, oh, I bought this electric car because I was doing my bit for the planet, and yes, it is cheaper to operate, thanks very much, and I never saw this coming. I never thought there would be eventually
anybody with any sense would have seen it coming. But anyway,
so but anyway, it's still got a way to run before it's implemented, and there will be a consultation. But there are some other things about electric vehicles in the budget which are quite interesting as well. So the electric car grant, which can be up to £3,750 when you actually buy the thing, has been extended as part of the budget. So there's an incentive still, perhaps to balance out these concerns, an incentive to get on with and buy them. There's also £1.5 billion extension of something called Drive 35, which is a scheme to promote the manufacturing side of electric vehicles in the UK. Additionally, there was another £100 million put aside for EV charging infrastructure, and that's after £400 million from the spending review in the summer. And then perhaps a sort of a bit of a delayed action bomb on all of this. There's going to be a consultation on easier cross-pavement charging. So this is the idea that you'll be able to sort of run a gully from your house across the pavement to the road where your vehicle is parked. So you can put a cable in it and charge the thing more easily if you don't have a drive or a big space. But I would have thought, I mean, there's enough controversy at the moment about how road space is used and pavement space is used between the various conflicting parties, such as pedestrians and cyclists and wheelchair users. And I would have thought that this potentially could be quite a controversial issue with the idea that our pavements are going to be dug up in quite a massive way potentially to allow for this.
And of course, it doesn't get around the problem if you live on the 8th floor of a tower block. You're not going to manage to kind of charge your car.
No, that's right. There's
running a wire on now 8 floors is not not going to be feasible.
You can't do this stuff by some sort of virtual reality laser or anything like that, at least in the foreseeable future. So
and the big one is fuel duty.
Well, then of course, coming back to more conventional forms of motoring. After the very long freeze, and not just freeze, but discount in the fuel duty, which was introduced by the previous government, this government, as a cost of living measure, trumpeted that the discount would continue to be in place until August 2026, but after that, it will be gradually phased out by March 2027, I think it is.
That's right. Yes, I think April 27. Yeah. They're going to start charging a higher rate.
Yes. So that discount will disappear. So now the people that use petrol and diesel vehicles, you might say they've had a good run, but they're also not backward in coming forward when it comes to complaining about the costs of motoring. So again, we may see a delayed action response and reaction to this.
Well, if you remember, it was the fuel duty protests of whatever it was 20 years ago.
2001, I think.
Yeah, 2001. That really had such an impact that nobody's dared to increase fuel duty since then.
That's right. The government also has introduced something called a fuel finder scheme, which is supposed to help motorists ensure that any discounts which are in place are actually being passed on by retailers.
Right.
Because there's a suspicion, in fact, an allegation really, that in some cases these discounts are not passed on, and that the retailers sort of trouser the difference. So that's something else that came in last week's budget.
And is there not now going to be a taxation on private jets?
Yes, so that was another introduction in the section of the budget actually on wealth. They, rather than in transport, it was announced that there would be an extension of the higher rate of air passenger duty to a bigger proportion of the private jet market,
Right.
as a sort of levy on the better off, the people that tend to use those kind of forms of transport. So that
You and me, unfortunately.
well, I don't think I've ever been on a private
Private
jet.
jet, no.
So, Christy, I don't know whether you have, but I don't.
No, not really.
I
No.
don't think I've ever enjoyed that luxury. Only on the telly do you see these things. Then, of course, if I come back to some of the other aspects of roads, which featured very heavily in this budget, roads and motoring, a further £2 billion was pledged annually to local authorities to deal with pothole repairs. And
There's always stuff about pothole repairs in budgets, aren't they? And
it never seems to make any difference.
it never makes any difference. I mean, I've got enormous potholes kind of a couple of 100 yards away from where we're speaking, and I'm sure that it won't get dealt with. But hey,
There was also the extension of VAT to ride-sharing taxi apps.
right.
Because apparently they'd been exploiting some kind of loophole that meant that they didn't have to pay VAT.
Yes, this means that your Uber ride's going to cost 20% more.
Presumably so, yes, that's right. So that might be something which people will notice in their pockets, but something that didn't rate when it came to the impact on the cost of living, presumably. Interestingly as well, and I'm not sure this has been said anywhere else previously, but the famous £3 fare cap on buses in
Yes.
England
Yeah,
has now been extended to March 2027,
right.
and that was in the budget
That's
documentation.
really.
And I don't think I'd seen that
No.
anywhere else. I could be, stood corrected if that's come somewhere else. And then there was a number of other pieces around rail and infrastructure, not very much in that area, but a very curious statement about HS2, which featured so massively in the spending review in the summer. But it was announced that HS2 Limited is undertaking something called a sprint project. I've never heard that term before. A sprint project to release land no longer needed by HS2 between London and Birmingham. So this comes across as a bit of a sort of fire sale, to realise a bit of cash.
It's always be trivial in relation to the cost, which is going to be between, I understand, between 80 and 120 billion, but they can't even hone it down to anything smaller than that. And two things about that, Mark. One is that I understand that they're not going to go ahead with any further land purchases north of Birmingham, and so therefore there's going to be no attempt to revive that part of the railway, which was actually in a lot of ways the most useful one. They're going to somehow de-scope it. And the second thing is that the review that's been carried out by Mark Wilde will not be published in December. It probably is not going to be published until February. And this is a kind of root and branch reappraisal of the whole scheme and how we're going to progress. And my snouts say that basically they're going to focus on the bit between Old Oak Common and Birmingham and sort of a bit, run the tunnel boring machines down to Euston. But they're basically not going to do anything north of Birmingham, and they're certainly not, as I mentioned, going to do anything about phase 2, which was up to Crewe.
But on the some of the other aspects of infrastructure, Christian, the budget does contain support for the Mayor of London's extension of the Docklands Light Railway to Thamesmead.
1.7 billion.
But it's kind of it's a bit of an odd bit of support, because it basically says, yes, you can build that and you can pay for it, mate. So there is a pledge to a vague pledge to a long-term contribution from central government,
but not of how much, not of all the 1.7.
No, and it basically seems to be that they're allowing the mayor to spend London's own money on improving London's scheme. And in a way related to that, the in the Chancellor's speech quite early on, she gave a ringing endorsement to Northern Powerhouse Rail. But then you look in the document and there's absolutely nothing other than the aspirations of the Northern Growth Corridor, and saying that this is something important for the economy and for growth, but nothing when it comes to actual decisions or specific investment. Slightly more positively, for the great city of Derby, there's a reiteration of the pledge that Great British Railways will be based there. And in fact, Derby has now assumed such importance as a city in this country that it gets its own little section in the budget about all the other projects and investments and high-end manufacturing that's going on there. For example, small modular reactors and aerospace. So I think that covers everything that was on my
Well, thank you very
list.
much, Mark. That's a great summary and details to follow, but I think that gives us a real steer of the way things are going.
For 20 years, we've been told to use the term active travel, but it's now fallen out of favour. And instead, we talk about walking, wheeling and cycling when it comes to those modes of travel. The government, the UK government, has just launched a consultation on walking, wheeling and cycling for England. And this is a subject that listeners will know is a matter of great interest to Christian, who's been talking to Laura Laker, who is a writer for The Guardian, The Sunday Times, Cyclist and Cycling Plus, and also hosts the Streets Ahead podcast, and is a leading authority on walking, wheeling and cycling, particularly cycling policy, and who is the author of the book Potholes and Pavements, A Bumpy Ride on Britain's National Cycle Network. Laura has some interesting views on this consultation, and here's her discussion with Christian.
I'm with Laura Laker, who is a cycling journalist and author of Potholes and Pavements, a book about her adventures around the National Cycle Network, where she found that there were certainly lots of gaps in it, and I think kind of occasionally found dead ends and all sorts of mess for what should be really a amazing kind of national part of our national infrastructure. So, Laura, you've been looking at the recently published strategy on cycling and walking, and I think you have some criticism of it. But tell us what that is, first of all.
Yeah, so great to be on the show. So I have had an interest in kind of national cycling strategy, which for years now. And I wrote this book about the National Cycle Network, and it was really intended to use the NCN as a proxy for cycling infrastructure in Britain. And one of the things that sets the tone for kind of cycling in, England in this case, is this thing called the Cycling and Walking Investment Strategy, which sounds terribly boring, but actually is very important.
Sound boring.
Oh yeah, they all sound boring.
Terrible.
So I kind of, like many people, I fell into the trap when it first was launched of thinking, you kind of sort of glance over it and you think, oh, okay, move on.
Your mind goes blank with that sort of
exactly. Your eyes start unfocusing and you can't. But actually, this is a really, really important document because it sets the tone for the next 5 years. And the purpose of it's CWIS 3, so Cycling Walking Investment Strategy 3, and that means there's been 2 before it. And the initial CWIS, a decade or so ago, was intended to set the tone for cycling and walking, but it was intended to put it on a par with roads. So one of my bugbears, and one of the things I really try and underline in the book, is that unlike roads or rail, with active travel, with cycling and walking, we don't have a 5-year plan. We don't have consistent funding. We don't have national leadership. And we don't have a kind of plan for infrastructure. And for roads, RIS 3, Road Investment Strategy, does that. And it very clearly sets out, it talks about roads, specific roads. It talks about the strategic road network, and that's what it's concerned with, its infrastructure. And the intention was to try and put cycling and walking on a on a par with the roads, and the long-term funding is essential, and there is consultation. I was comparing the two, the consultation with the cycling and walking and with the roads, and they're incredibly, it couldn't be more different. Cycling and walking talks about aspirations and visions, and none of it talks about routes really. So whereas the road investment strategy is all about roads. It's talking about improvement and investment. There's evidence. It talks about even a pipeline of programs for local roads. And if there isn't money for those local roads, if they're important to the whole, then they'll be funded. And you get none of this with active travel. And so, as I discovered with the National Cycle Network, and not to pick on the NCN because it's run by a wonderful charity, the Walk Wheel Cycle Trust, formerly Sustrans. But this is how infrastructure is. It's very patchy, and this is because there's no long-term funding, there's no leadership centrally, and it's very, very hard to deliver.
Right, and yet we know that if there was more cycling, if there was more walking, people would be healthier. It would save the National Health Service vast amounts of money. So, if an intelligent government would actually be putting serious resources into this, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they would. And it's such a sticking point. It's such a kind of a way of thinking that's really hard to change. And you see this when you talk to politicians. You see it when you talk to I met a shadow minister recently, and they were still convinced that road infrastructure, trunk road infrastructure, was the only thing really, and that cycling was insignificant. And from your last episode, Chris Boardman was talking about a 12-to-1 return on investment for giving people free cycles. And the great thing about cycling infrastructure is the enormous return on investment in terms of health. We know that our health as a nation is declining. We know that building activity into your day, kind of incidentally, is one of the best ways to get people fit. I mean, it's all very well telling someone to go to a gym, but most people aren't going to do it, myself included. I can't be bothered. It's an extra thing. It can be a bit intimidating. It costs money. But walking and cycling, you can just do that while you're going to work. You can do that when you're running your errands. But quite often, people don't feel safe doing so. They don't feel like it's accessible. But yeah, I mean,
does everything in this document actually tell us how to do this or encourages this, or is it completely silent on that aspect?
In terms of how to get there,
Yes.
how to kind of get to a world, well, not really. I mean, it talks about it's got various kind of links to other kind of government legislation. It's got a long-term national vision, which is that the government wants walking, wheeling and cycling to be a safe, easy and accessible option for everyone by 2035. But that's
What does
not
that
long.
mean? What does
Well,
that mean?
exactly. This is a consultation, but the road investment strategy is like, well, we're going to improve these roads. We're going to link up. This is how we're going to improve, expand the network, improve the network. It talks about an aging asset, which, cycling routes in the UK are generally aging assets, or in fact, non-existent assets in many cases. Sometimes it's just a painted cycle lane, which might have been okay in the 80s or even 90s when the roads were much more quiet, but they're not. We know that people aren't going to cycle if they're just expected to ride, within sort of elbow distance of someone's wing mirror.
Absolutely.
And then there are some objectives, two objectives, which are to ensure people are safe to travel actively and ensure people feel it is an easy choice. These are all very,
High level.
worthy objectives. But exactly. I think that's a good description for it. It's extremely high level. What it needs is to talk about, how are we going to get there? How are we going to deliver on this? And what you need is infrastructure. It's not just about infrastructure. You can't just build it and people will turn up. You need those kind of the revenue funding, the kind of programs that help people to get on bikes, community groups to kind of enable people who don't know how to cycle, who don't have access to cycles, who might not feel that it's for them. And so there's really important groups, like Joyriders, Cycle Sisters, and there's so many of these amazing groups out there who really transform people's lives through cycling. But it needs to talk about specifics. And one thing that I talk about in my book, and I've got a manifesto at the end, is that there needs to be some kind of national leadership on cycling, because at the moment individual councils are trying to do individual bike lanes, and then we've all seen them, the articles in the local paper with outcry about this one bike lane. And with the National Cycle Network, the great thing about that, when at its inception ahead of the millennium and the funding that they got from the National Lottery to then kind of roll out, they only had something like a quarter of the funding they needed, and local authorities gave the rest. But the reason it was so successful was that it was this national vision, and people got excited about that. Local authorities got excited about that. They wanted to be part of this national vision. And I think it does help to sidestep some of that cultural war stuff, like, why are you building a bike lane? Well, it's part of the National Cycle Network.
Absolutely.
Just as part of a national plan, we can contribute locally and we can be part of something bigger, and to treat it like a proper transport mode. And that's really something that's lacking.
But it doesn't
my-
Active Travel England do this? Isn't that what Active Travel England is?
They are an enabler at the moment. So they are helping build capacities within local authorities, because quite often local authorities don't have the skills they need. A lot of them had to fire their cycling staff during austerity, and so they don't have the knowledge or the capacity to start designing decent infrastructure. I mean, in the years before Active Travelling, and you'd see some terrible stuff going in, and it was with the best intentions, but the local authorities don't know what they're doing in a lot of cases. So they've done a great job in terms of improving capacity and designs in local authorities and bringing them up to a certain level and funding them based on what those local authorities can deliver. But then you still have a gap. I did a freedom of information request to 222 local authorities in England, and I asked them whether they were I know it was a little bit ambitious, but I went through it eventually, and I think 10% of them, about 20, were trying to deliver cycle routes into urban cycle routes where landowners were blocking progress. And almost none of them, 1 or 2% of them, were using compulsory purchase. And this is something that we do for roads. And the reason was they don't have the kind of case studies they need. So nobody does it because they're scared. It costs too much money, and they just don't have the capacity to do it. And we just don't treat cycling in the same way as roads. And Active Travel England talks about kind of national plans delivered locally, or national plans designed locally. But it really, the bit that's missing is that national leadership. And I think the compulsory purchase stuff that councils aren't doing really shows what's missing in this piece, is that they need some kind of support from national government, some kind of leadership on where these routes will go. And what I would argue is we already have a kind of, if we're going to treat cycle routes like roads, we already have, the kind of trunk roads, the strategic road network. We've got the National Cycle Network. And then we've got hundreds of local authorities have got local cycling and walking infrastructure plans, or LCWIPs, another fun acronym. So they've kind of put out these maps of where cycle routes and walking routes might go, which is brilliant. But they're not joined up. There's no kind of strategic plan as to which would be like the main routes and which would feed in to the kind of to smaller destinations. And so there needs to be that kind of strategic thinking at a national level. And there was a map in the RIS3 consultation. There's no map in the cycling walking investment strategy. There needs to be some kind of sense of, this is the A roads for cycling, these are the B roads, these are the C roads, the high interurban routes. Copenhagen delivered some interurban cycle network in the last sort of 10-15 years, and it was one of the best pieces of investment in terms of benefits for social benefits for people.
Yes, I heard that they
ever.
actually linked up all their suburbs with cycling
right.
routes as well, and brought people in from further afield. You end up people doing much, and of course electric bikes would help people commute 10 or 15 miles quite easily.
That's right.
But the one I mean, you mentioned Copenhagen, of course. The one success story, and you mentioned this in the piece you wrote about this, is of course London, and London just heard that we've just heard there's 1.5 million bike journeys a day in London, and which is extraordinary.
It's unbelievable.
And so is that an example that we can use, or is just London, the exception? I mean, how have we managed this?
Yeah. Well, I think London's a great example. Because often we look overseas, and actually we do have this brilliant example here. And I remember when Boris Johnson, when he was mayor of London, announced this basically £1 billion plan for cycling in London. And it was going to have these main road routes, which was just the start. You know, you really need a network, but it was the beginning, the main road routes. And he didn't have that £1 billion of funding. That wasn't there. What he had was a vision and a plan to deliver, and the money came along, as happens with most infrastructure. And you know, I remember being on a bridge in Vauxhall. The first route was rolled out I don't know, end of November 2015, so just about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. And there's that famous photograph of the man flipping Boris the bird on a bicycle. And as he came over for the photo call for the press. And you know, that was the sort of culmination of several years' work at that point, but that was the beginning of the rollout of those high quality protected cycle routes. And since then the network has kind of expanded, and it's kind of more of a mesh than a sort of
But
spike.
I always
So it's
thought that
really
the key thing he did was to build this lane along the embankment near just about outside Parliament, and took away some road space for that. And there's huge protest about it, and people saying, "Oh, this is a disaster." And now you get kind of a couple of million people a year using it, and it's emblematic. It kind of shows, hey, this is a statement, and we need more of that. But how can we deliver more of that in, I don't know, Stockport or Ipswich or Exeter or wherever?
Yeah. Well, in the summer, in July, in York, there was a big conference, and 13 of the 14 English mayors signed up to deliver, well, to plan for a national network of routes between them within their mayoral authorities. And although it's not a network, it's a series of school streets and town centre improvements and some bike lanes. It doesn't connect up. But what it was a political statement about, you know, we believe in the power of cycling and walking. And there's a particular focus on children, which I think is right. So they want to ensure that kids are safe to travel first. So there's going to be a bunch more metro mayors coming online in 2026. So there's going to be a lot more regions with these leaders who realise, hang on, a lot of journeys are short. And you know, this is the kind of thing that we should be delivering. Most of our journeys are very short. Um,
But you think
so
that's
yeah,
a national focus. So that's a good
yeah, I
start.
think it
That
needs.
that's
Yeah.
a national. It needs. So who do you think should this be? Government, or should it be a separate national cycling? I mean, I was on a board of Cycling England about 10 years ago, and it's under Steve Norris, and he was quite an inspirational figure for that. So is that what we need? A kind of, again, a new kind of Cycling England type board?
Well, I mean, that's kind of what Active Travel England does. It's just that they don't have enough of a remit. And I don't think this should be a nationally, you know, an entirely top-down thing. But I think, as we know with roads, there needs to be a long-term 5-year funding settlement, as with roads, because at the moment, you know, a charity that's run on kind of yearly funding, you can't plan anything. As Xavier Bryce, the CEO of the Walk Wheel Cycle Trust, the custodian of National Cycle Network, told me, if you don't have multi-year funding, you can't even plan an extension on a house. So you really need that. There needs to be a pipeline of projects like there is for RIS and for HLOS, the high level whatever it is for rail. And for a kind of to set out the network, to kind of plan that with the regional and local authorities, and to set targets, and then they're delivered locally. They're delivered by the regional mayors, they're delivered by the local authorities in the same way that we'd kind of do roads. But it just needs that national leadership and the assurance that there's funding, and to kind of link up. And the network, I mean, you can call it a network of networks, you know, bringing all these different routes together, the NCN, the mayors' networks, the LCC whips and local authorities, and, you know, just start to designate which ones we deliver first, you know, linking up to train stations, linking up to schools, linking up to places where people need to be, and kind of building it out like that.
Okay. So lastly, to wrap up, this is a consultation paper. what should people do?
So you can reply to the consultation and you can say that it needs to be stronger, that there needs to be, a pipeline of projects, there needs to be long-term funding, there needs to be some kind of mapping of the networks, and then a decision made on what gets delivered, so that we actually, have a plan that matches our roads plan, because we know that works because we keep doing it.
We keep on building lots of roads, yes.
We keep on building lots of roads, and not all roads are bad, but it's gotten a little bit out of hand, and it's just not a great return on investment. We know cycling is huge return on investment. It's such an enabler. So many people don't have access to cars. Cars are extremely expensive, and utter reliance on them is not a transport strategy. That most of us only
in our world, we every transport planner, most of whom always cycle. We all know that. Anybody who's worked in transport for we all know the solutions, don't we?
I know, that's the thing. It's just changing kind of stuck thinking. But I think if we're talking about, we've got a Labour government, it should be about infrastructure. This is such a brilliant piece of infrastructure. If you're thinking about children, something like 3/4 of children live within a 15-minute bike ride of a secondary school. 90% live within a 15-minute walk or bus journey from a primary school, and that was from the CWIS 10 years ago. That's a direct quote. It just takes some kind of national vision, but I think it's something we can get excited about. I think cycling, enormous returns on investment. It kind of helps to meet the government's kind of key targets in terms of their missions: improving health, opportunity, safer streets, driving economic growth, and decarbonising. Cycling and walking do all of these things, and how many other policy areas can you really say achieve that? It's just kind of there on a plate.
Okay. Well, let's hope that your call to action is heeded, and let's hope that our listeners send in their views, which actually have to be in by December the 15th, I think, isn't it?
15th. Yes, I was about to say. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's not a huge amount of time.
Thank you, Laura. That's been great to hear all that, and thanks for taking up your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, Mark, there's been cock-ups and messes and chaos in the privatised railway ever since it was sold off in the mid-90s. But the recent one over the train that was going to be a ghost train from Manchester to London is one of the best ones. And this was apparently a decision by the Office of Rail and Road that the 7 o'clock from Manchester to London, which gets there very fast in just under 2 hours because it stops at Stockport and nowhere else, was too unreliable to count as in the kind of performance figures, and therefore it was going to run empty, and it needed to run empty because it needed to take staff down to London in order that they could work on the trains kind of heading back north. And somehow this mad idea got through the Office of Road and Rail until The Guardian publicised it. And that was a great scoop by them, by Gwyn Topham, their transport correspondent. And within 3 or 4 days, Peter Hendy, the rail minister, wrote a stinking letter, a wonderfully worded kind of letter saying this is completely mad. And the ORR, which is supposed to be an independent regulator, of course, immediately retreated. But there are still 4 trains apparently where they are going to make them run and empty. And this is all because there's a surfeit of trains on the West Coast Main Line because they've allowed some new open access trains. And so this story's got a bit to run. But boy, was that really one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode.
If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.